Hello, dear friends. I am re-recording something that I published yesterday, and here's the reason why. I did a rather extensive teaching out of the book of Genesis on the life of Joseph and the grief and the lessons that we have to learn from this teaching. Here's the problem. YouTube, when I published it, I don't know what the problem was, but I recorded the entire thing and only half of it went online. When I rechecked the video, the second half was missing, and by having the second half missing, well, that's where the biggest lessons were. Now, I gleaned a lot when I was reading through the life of Joseph, and it's really long in the Bible, so I've condensed it as much as I can. Take a moment with me today and let's see what we can learn from this life of Joseph. This is from the story of Jacob having children with Leah, Rachel, and their two servant women. Now, with polygamy comes jealousy and a favorite wife. Truthfully, Leah appeared to be the best wife. In spite of her grief from Jacob not treating her that way, she was faithful in trying to please Jacob, and she did not steal from her father's house like Rachel did. But Rachel, Leah's younger sister, was Jacob's favorite wife. Leah's sons watched the flocks and brought provision to the family, while Rachel's son Joseph was kept close by and cared for and educated. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 3-7, it says, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the middle of the field, tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Then in Genesis 37, 9-11, it says, Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I have had another dream, he said. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed before me. This time he told his dream to his father as well as to his brothers. But his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that? He asked. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you? But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. There can be no doubt that there will be jealousy and hostility among wives and children if you show favoritism. It also sets the favorite up to be rejected by the others. In Joseph's day, everyone had a cloak. Robes were used for warmth, to bundle belongings if traveling, to bundle up babies, to sit on, and also as security for a loan. Most of them were plain, short-sleeved, and knee-length. When Jacob had a robe made for Joseph, it was similar to one made for royalty. It is not unusual for Jacob to feel such great love for a child born to him in his old age. When we get older, we are more aware of how precious those young lives are. After my kids were all grown, I had the opportunity to be the mother figure for a grandchild from 8 months to adolescent. I am unable to describe the depth of love I felt for that child and still do. I spent a lot of time with him and taught him. Such great love. We had a wonderful bond. The problem was that Jacob did not show his other sons that depth of love. Although we can see this caused problems, this was also part of God's plan. He was working it all for a greater good. It is sad to me that Jacob scolded Joseph for his dream. How does a person control their dream? The dreams were actually from God revealing the future to Joseph. God knew what was to come. In Genesis 37, verses 18 to 22, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without us laying a hand on him. Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 26a, it says, Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime instead of hurting him. Let's sell him to these Ishmaelite traders. So Joseph was sold. The brothers ripped his cloak, put blood from an animal on it, and told Jacob that he had been killed by a wild animal. This was culture shock for Joseph. He went from being a treasured child with a private education to being a slave in a foreign country. Slavery is still in our world today, I'm sad to say, and it is sickening to know how easy it is to sell another human being. This was shock and desperation for Joseph, but God's hand was in it. Joseph had the good start that was building his character, and now God was working on his pride and developing him to serve others. A true leader is a servant. Joseph faced a 30-day journey through the desert as he was bound by cruel slave traders. Some slaves had short lives. Joseph, in no doubt, would have been learning about the hardship that others had to endure. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 33, it says, their father recognized it, the cloak, immediately. Yes, he said, it is my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him. Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes and dressed himself in burlap. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. His family all tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. I will go to my grave mourning for my son, he would say, and then he would weep. Joseph's brothers didn't think about what they were doing to the rest of the family, especially their father. And can you imagine their mother, Rachel? They were blinded by jealousy and hate. Now God could begin his work on the brothers. They had to live with their guilt over the cruel treatment of Joseph, what he was going through, and possibly that he died. They had to live with a lie they told to their father instead of letting him know that Joseph was still alive and a slave. They had to live with the change in their father, the grief that nearly killed him. This they had to live with for years. God was working on their hearts. Hate was replaced with regret. In autumn 2019, my oldest son was in a horrible car accident coming down Vail Pass. When the paramedics got there, his car was upside down, and he had to be cut from his seatbelt to get him out. He was in some shock. The next week, I came down with RSV. The next week after that, my grandson was lost to me. That week, my husband told me he wanted a divorce and wanted me to move out immediately. One more week after that, I came down with COVID and almost died. I was on oxygen for months. This all happened within 3 weeks. I understand Jacob's pain. The grief I feel for my grandson has never ended. It is life-altering. If you are a grandparent that has no access to your grandchildren, I understand your pain. It is crushing. In Genesis 39, verses 2 to 5a, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did, as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake." Rich homes like Potiphar's would have been 2 to 3 stories tall, elaborate with gardens and balconies. He likely would have had live entertainment in his home, bowls of fruit, alabaster vases, paintings, hand-carved chairs, beautiful rugs. This was a different life than Joseph had known, and he was put in charge of the household. He would have still grieved for his father and mother, but he held good ethics even though he was enslaved. In Genesis 39, 6b, it says, "Joseph was very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. 'Come and sleep with me,' she demanded, but Joseph refused. 'Look,' he told her, 'my master trusts me with everything in his household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held nothing back from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God.'" Joseph didn't say he'd be hurting her or Potiphar. He said it would be a great sin against God. In spite of his circumstances, Joseph was still embracing his faith in God. Sexual sin doesn't just hurt people. It is an act of disobedience against God. In all of this, God was still in control. In Genesis 39, 16 to 23, it says, "She kept the cloak, Joseph's, with her until her husband came home. Then she told him her story. 'That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me,' she said. 'But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me.'" Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Potiphar's wife covered up her shame by telling a horrible lie about Joseph. It would seem like Joseph's life goes from bad to worse, but God had his hand on him the whole time. The prisons were vile. Some prisoners spent the rest of their lives there because trials didn't always happen. During this time, our Joseph was further gaining skills and experience of management in the worst of circumstances. He took it as an opportunity for personal growth to still serve God. Everything he did succeeded, enough that the warden put his trust in him. It goes on to Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker being thrown into prison. Eventually, both of them had dreams that disturbed them. Joseph was able to interpret their dreams, and they were both correct predictions of the future. The cupbearer had been in charge of tasting all Pharaoh's food to make sure he wasn't poisoned. As predicted, he was restored to his position with Pharaoh. The prediction from the chief baker's dream also came true. He was impaled on a pole, and the birds ate from his flesh. Our Joseph still remained in prison. In Genesis 41, verses 1 through 12 say, 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreams that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing on the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up from behind the Nile, but those cows were scrawny and thin. The cows that stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy fat cows. At this point in his dream, Pharaoh woke up, but he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but they were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by his dreams. So he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the chief cupbearer spoke up. "Today I have been reminded of my failure," he told Pharaoh. "Some time ago, you were angry with the chief cupbearer and chief baker, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night, the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. He went on to explain that everything that happened to Joseph, or everything happened as Joseph had predicted. Pharaoh sent for him. He shaved, changed his clothes, and was brought before Pharaoh. Back then, it was normal to have magicians in the palace, but they were unable to interpret Pharaoh's dream. It was God that gave Joseph this insight. His most important opportunity came when he least expected it. He had still been sitting in prison. Pharaoh goes on to tell Joseph his dreams. In Genesis chapter 41, 25 through 32, it says, Joseph responded, "Both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt, but afterward there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having these 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen." So Joseph was able to give Pharaoh a survival plan for the next 14 years, thanks to God. A plan was necessary to keep the country from perishing during the severe famine to come. Pharaoh recognized that Joseph was a man filled with the Spirit of God. Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of everything, second only to himself. In Genesis 41 to 45a, then it says, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, kneel down. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, and I'm going to try to say this, Zaphenath-Paneah. He also gave him a wife, whose name was Asenath. Now think about this. Joseph went from being sold as a slave, and in the years that came, he became second in command to Pharaoh. Nothing is impossible with God. Joseph was 30 years old when he became second in command in Egypt. He went from being a slave to being second in command to Pharaoh in only 13 years. No one can make that happen except for God. I'm sure at this point he thought he would never see his father's family again. The prosperity in Egypt happened just as God had described in Pharaoh's dreams. Grain was incredibly valuable back then because there was no refrigeration. They stored the excess grain. In Genesis 41:49 to 52, it says, He piled up huge amounts of grain like sand on the seashore. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was too much to measure. During this time, before the first famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On. Joseph named his oldest son Manasseh, for he said, God made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. Joseph named his second son Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. At last Joseph found peace in his life with his wife and the birth of his 2 sons. God was with him. Jacob still believed Joseph to be dead. His son, Benjamin, was born before Rachel died. He still grieved Joseph. With great love comes great grief. After 7 years, the severe famine came. It didn't just affect Egypt. It reached beyond Canaan and affected Joseph's father, brothers, and their family. I would say God's hand was in this. In Genesis 42, verse 1 to 2, it says, When Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, Why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive, otherwise we'll die. So 10 brothers went to Egypt trying to buy grain, so their families wouldn't starve to death. Jacob kept Benjamin behind. Benjamin was Joseph's only full brother. The brothers had to go before Joseph to try to buy grain, but they didn't recognize him. Joseph knew it was his brothers, and he was emotionally affected. He asked them many personal questions about his family, and then accused them of being spies. His brothers pleaded that they only came to buy food. At first, he put them in prison for 3 days. Reuben felt God was punishing them for what they did to Joseph. They still didn't know it was him. Eventually, Joseph released them. But he had his brother Simeon tied up before their very eyes. He had their sacks filled with grain, and he sent them back to Canaan. When they checked their bags on the journey, they discovered their money bags hidden in the grain. This struck terror in them. When they returned to Jacob's Canaan, they told him what happened. In Genesis chapter 42, verse 36, it says, Jacob exclaimed, "You are robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you want to take Benjamin too? Everything is going against me." Well, Jacob isn't getting Parent of the Year award right now. He put total blame and responsibility on his son's shoulders. The brothers still felt guilt over what they did to Joseph. The famine continued to ravage the land. It wasn't until they were out of food again that Jacob agreed to allow the brothers, including Benjamin, to return to Egypt. Simeon was still in prison. Judah took on the responsibility for Benjamin's safety. They returned to Egypt with double the money because they thought the money bags returned to them was a mistake. They were very fearful returning to Egypt. This time, Joseph gave instructions for them to be brought into his house. The brothers were terrified. In Genesis 43:19-23, it says, the brothers approached the manager of Joseph's household and spoke to him at the entrance to the palace. "Sir," they said, "we came to Egypt once before to buy food. But as we were returning home, we stopped for the night and opened our sacks. Then we discovered that each man's money, the exact amount paid, was in the top of his sack. Here it is. We brought it back with us. We also have additional money to buy our food. We have no idea who put that money in our sacks." "Relax. Don't be afraid," the household manager told them. "Your God, the God of your father, must have put this treasure in your sacks. I know I received your payment." Then he released Simeon and brought him out to them. Joseph himself had paid for the grain on their first trip to Egypt, but they didn't know this. This time, Joseph had a feast prepared for them. Notice that his household manager gave credit to God and not some Egyptian deity. They still didn't recognize Joseph. They ate at a separate table. Egyptians considered themselves superior to shepherds and nomads and wouldn't sit at the same table. This time, when the brothers were leaving the sacks, with sacks full of grain, Joseph not only gave instructions to return their money, but also to hide Joseph's silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Joseph's silver cup was one of the symbols of his authority. Egyptians thought it contained supernatural powers. They thought that Joseph would be able to predict the future from the bubbles and ripples in the drink it contained. After they had traveled a short distance, Joseph had them stopped and their sacks searched. The goblet was found in Benjamin's sack, just where it had been hidden. In Genesis 44:16-18, it says, "O my Lord, what can we say to you? How can we explain this? How can we prove our innocence? God is punishing us for our sins. My Lord, we have all returned to be your slaves, all of us, not just our brother who had your cup in his sack." "No," Joseph said, "I would never do such a thing. Only the man who stole my cup will be my slave." The rest of you may go back to your father in peace." Then Judas stepped forward and said, "Please, my Lord, let your servant say just one word to you. Please do not be angry with me. Even though you are powerful as Pharaoh himself." Judas still doesn't recognize Joseph and knows he could easily have him killed. But at this point, he is more afraid of his father, Jacob, dying because Benjamin isn't returned to him. His heart has softened. When he was younger, Judah had shown no care for Joseph or his father. Now he is so concerned about his father that he is willing to die for Benjamin. He tells Joseph that Jacob is extremely attached to Benjamin. In Genesis 45, verses 1 to 3, it says, "Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, 'Out, all of you.' So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him. And word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. 'I am Joseph,' he said to his brothers. 'Is my father still alive?' But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. At first, they couldn't believe it was Joseph. When they finally wrapped their heads around the fact it was him, they were in great fear for two reasons. One, because he was the second most powerful person in Egypt, and two, because of what they had done to him. Joseph did all he could to reassure his brothers that it was okay and all part of God's plan. He no longer felt anger or bitterness toward them. Pharaoh was glad to hear his brothers were there. Joseph had saved Egypt. Pharaoh invited his whole family to come live in Egypt. Joseph's whole family, that is, and to have the best of everything. This was God. God made a way to provide for the descendants of Abraham. God was preparing a way for the nation of Israel. In Genesis 45, verses 24 to 26, it says, "So Joseph sent his brothers off, and as he left, he called after them, 'Don't quarrel about all this along the way.' And they left Egypt and returned to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. Joseph is still alive," they told him, "and he is governor over all the land of Egypt." Jacob was stunned at the news. He couldn't believe it. Joseph had been rejected, kidnapped, enslaved, imprisoned. He forgave and shared his prosperity. Jesus forgives or offers us the same thing. He offers us forgiveness and shares life in his kingdom. It took a moment for Jacob to be able to believe the news that Joseph was still alive. He needed to hear the facts, and the brothers explained everything Joseph had told them. In Genesis chapter 46, verse 1 to 4, it says, "So Jacob set out for Egypt with all his possessions. And when he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. During the night, God spoke to him in a vision. 'Jacob, Jacob,' he called. 'Here I am,' Jacob replied. 'I am the God of your father,' the voice said. 'Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make your family into a great nation. I will go with you down to Egypt. I will bring you back again. You will die in Egypt, but Joseph will be with you to close your eyes.'" God holds our future in his hands. Don't give up hope. We have to put our trust in God. He knows the path better than we do. It is normal to experience fear, but don't let it paralyze you. God promised Joseph that he would be with him when he died, was fulfilling a great desire of his heart. Notice that as he traveled to Egypt, Jacob also stopped in Beersheba to build an altar and worship God. No matter what we're going through, it is appropriate to worship God. In Genesis 46:29-30, it says, Joseph prepared his chariot and traveled to Goshen to meet his father, Jacob. When Joseph arrived, he embraced his father and wept, holding him for a long time. Finally, Jacob said to Joseph, Now I am ready to die, since I have seen your face again and know you are still alive. Jacob moved his whole family to Egypt, but they lived apart from the Egyptians. Although they spent many years apart, God restored Jacob's son Joseph to him. These past months, I was able to see my grandson I had lost 5 to 6 years ago, as well as meet my other grandchildren. I hadn't met them yet. My time with them was brief and never one-on-one, but it was an answer to many years of prayer, pain, and grief. When I returned home, I told God that I'm ready to die now, for I have seen my loved grandchild that I had lost. Nothing causes more pain than our families. With great grief, there is great love. Sometimes this side of heaven, the grief doesn't stop. But we must keep our faith that God has a plan. He will work all things for a greater purpose. Trust in Him, friends. Trust in Him in all things. God bless you.